Hi again. We're trying to finish off with chapter 11 now. Still got a couple more topics to deal with today. Um, we've just looked at Egypt and spent a bit of time looking at state formation and some of what became of Egypt as a state. But what about the rest of Africa? And in fact, I should actually just point out that everywhere that people lived, they developed some kind of societies. And the scale of those societies varied. We've seen in previous chapters that some communities stayed as smaller bands or tribes, but some moved into chiefdoms and complex chiefdoms, more hierarchical social structures with larger populations and maybe a more complex economy and division of labor. And some, of course, achieved what we call statehood, state-level society. It's not inevitable. It's not necessarily a good or bad thing to be a state. Some cultures just never created this larger scale identity around the state. So some places we're going to not spend very much time on, because what this course is about is mainly about prehistory. And so your book prioritizes those cultures that don't have a written record, a historical record. Those cultures that can really only be accessed by, at least their past can only be accessed by archaeology, not by historical records. But at the same time, we're now moving into some secondary states. And your book does cover some. I mentioned that primary states are the sort of state formation that took place when there were no other states around to act as a precedent. Nobody knew what a state was. Nobody had a model to work on. If you were to move to Mars and bring a group of people with you, you would already know a system of government and organization and how to operate a hierarchical system of society, right? That's what we're talking about when we talk about secondary state formation. They already know what the concepts are. They're just implementing them for their own purposes. So we've been looking at North Africa in terms of Egypt, and that seems to be a primary state. So let's look at the rest of Africa and some of the so-called secondary states that emerged. We already saw in a previous chapter that Great Zimbabwe was close, but most anthropologists, archaeologists believe that it was probably more akin to a chiefdom or a complex chiefdom. But some states did emerge in Africa, but these all seem to be at a slightly later period than Egypt, and thus had the model of Egypt. They were aware of what Egypt was like, and so when they formed their own states, they already knew what a state was, how it was constructed, and how to make it for themselves. Closest to Egypt, and actually one which took over Egypt for a period of time, was also in the Nile Valley, further to the south in Sudan, a place that was called Nubia. And in fact, they shared a lot of similarities with Egyptian culture. They constructed tomb complexes with pyramids. The pyramids look distinctly Nubian. They're much steeper sided rather than the equilateral sort of pyramidal shapes that we see in Egypt. They're much more acute angles in their apexes. But these clearly borrow some ideological and at least aesthetic influences from their neighbors to the north, such that there was actually even a dynasty of kings from the south, of pharaohs that took over Egypt. Also, you have in beyond the outside of the Nile Valley, you have Aksum in Ethiopia emerged, and this was slightly later when during the contemporary with the Roman Empire. So there were historical periods in some places, but Aksum itself was could be considered prehistoric in that sense, even though it's really more recent. In Aksum, they carved massive standing stones that are typical of this area, and it was had communication and contact with Rome and the Roman Empire, and its much of its trade was with, of course, their large-scale neighbors. Also in East Africa, we're staying east for the moment, large cities emerged that were contemporary with medieval Europe, and a very famous travel writer, sort of the Arab Marco Polo, if you want to use that analogy. His name was Ibn Battuta. He traveled around and wrote extensively about this. So this is where history and prehistory are overlapping. You can have people who are writing things down about places that weren't writing things down about themselves. So we have the archaeological traces that we can see, and we can show that in East Africa there were large cities that had trading routes all over Africa, but into the Middle East and also into Asia as well, possibly some by way of Indian Sea trade. So Ibn Battuta, who traveled all over the place on these routes, was a documenter of these things. And so we can see that history helps us to understand periods of time that are also only really directly represented by archaeology. So that's an interesting sort of fusion of these two, prehistory and history, sort of coming into contact with one another. Also, outside of the Nile Valley and even outside of East Africa is West African cities, especially in Benin in Nigeria, a very famous culture that was urban in nature, probably had a very hierarchical social structure, and they're very famous for brass making. And it's unclear whether Benin, which is in modern Nigeria, developed independently out of the cultures that were there, or if there was a significant influence from places like the Middle East or Europe, which made them more of a secondary state formation process. Also, you have in Mali, not far geographically from where we're talking about, in the location of Jenne, the modern city of Jenne is Jenne, which is the site, the archaeological site, which seems to have been a trade center in a river area, a riverine region, and the site itself predates extensive contact, so it seems to have been an indigenous development that developed about 250 BC and continued to be occupied until about 800 AD. And they had specialized artisans that are typical of this. And but the social organization of Jenne seems to be a little bit different than what we understand with this sort of top-down hierarchy of a single king or ruler who dominated the next class and the next class and the next class. It seems to have been a sort of competing rulers within the same urban area, and no centralized authority. So there were multiple authorities that coexisted at the same time, which of course is an interesting difference that we see, and one size fits all for state formation isn't always the case. So when we see a state, we tend to think of a certain type of social organization, but we need to establish that through archaeological facts and data. And so this is a case where even though there's a lot we don't understand about Geno, the excavators feel like that there is no they seem to believe that based on the archaeological evidence, there was no king of this place. It was multiple rulers that coexisted and had a decentralized authority in some sort of a shared power structure. Okay, so that's the rest of Africa that we're going to cover. I'll catch you next time and we'll look at the Mediterranean area. See you then.